Thanks for joining me for Bible study. And we're in my backyard because we're kind of getting into the backyard business of pastors, elders, and overseers. What is it that Paul tells Timothy in his charge to Timothy? This is what we need to be seeing in those that you put forth to be pastors of the churches that we've been planning. And so God's charge to Timothy. 1 Timothy chapter 3. I'm glad you joined me for these Bible studies. So 1 Timothy chapter 3. This is a faithful saying. If a man desires the position of a bishop, he desires a good work. A bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, temperate, sober-minded, of good behavior, hospitable, able to teach, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not covetous, one who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. For if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God? Not a novice, lest being puffed up with pride he fall into the same condemnation as the devil. Moreover, he must have a good testimony among those who are outside, lest he fall into reproach and the snare of the devil. Okay, so there's a number of places where Paul gives these kind of instructions. 1 Timothy chapter 3, 2 Timothy, Titus chapter 1. Peter gives some instructions like that in chapter 5 of his first letter. But this one is probably the most extensive. And so we're going to primarily stay here. And when you look at this, there's a long list of things going on here. But there's a kind of an overall thing that he's looking for, and it can be grouped into three more qualifications, so to speak. But the big thing that he's really looking for is the first thing. He must be blameless. He must be above reproach. He must be someone that people can respect inside and outside the church. And so, why is that? Well, one of them is because of the nature of the role. He's going to be, the word there in my translation is bishop. Some of yours will say overseer, but it's kind of the same. And it's a term that the Greeks used for just someone that was like a supervisor. He's going to be one who oversees the operations of what's going on. And so, looking out for those that are in his care. Now, in this, we also see where, in these lists of qualifications, we see where he's called an elder. And that was someone who had wisdom, and wisdom being not just knowledge, but a way to an understanding of applying it in this world. And so, an elder, and then again, someone who was an example. And then we also see where they're called pastors, and that comes from the word shepherd, someone who is leading the flock. And you know, shepherds had an important role in the scriptures, and that also Jesus and God themselves call themselves, the Lord is my shepherd. And Jesus said he was the good shepherd who laid down his life for the sheep. And if someone is pursuing that, then there is an internal desire at work that should be there. But it needs to be an internal desire from God, being the reason why they're pursuing it, striving for that. And that's why we see these lists. And so, what does it mean to be above reproach, to be blameless? Well, we see here a lot of these look at, his, what is he like as a person? As far as his interactions with others. Is he of good behavior? Or is he known as a brawler, or someone who's ready to get into a fight or start an argument? Those aren't the qualifications that you're looking for. Someone who is not covetous. If they're in it for the money, there's already something wrong. And it's odd that in America, at least, and even outside of America, there's a lot of them that we know, they seem to be in it for the money. And that seems to be their thing with their bling and all that. It's unfortunate. There is these things of what he looks like in his household. Is his house burning down, or is he managing the chaos? Because chaos is kind of a fact of life, family life. And it's important to remember that, especially among the Greeks, but also among Jews and Romans, that the father of the household had a lot of influence on even adult children that we don't see here in our more independent, individualistic culture in America. And then we see here where he is in other places, just, again, one that he is respected by the outsiders. And so I would encourage you to look in Titus chapter 2, 2 Timothy chapter 2, and 1 Peter 5, and just look through those qualifications, because sometimes when we see things worded a little different, then it makes more sense to us. But that above reproach, not greedy, self-controlled, able to control his emotions, control his desires, control his feelings, but in and out, his home, his life, his family, getting in his backyard business is a part of his testimony, to the point that he even lets people into his home, and it's not something to be ashamed of. The next part is how he interacts with others, and we touched on some of these because it talked about not quarrelsome. This is one that kind of surprises me how often it shows up in the qualifications, because it shows up here as well as in 2 Timothy, as well as in Peter, that he does not need to be one who's picking fights, who is looking for an argument. That's not a characteristic we need to be looking for. Now, there is a place for standing for the truth, but it's being able to teach the truth. And now this is where you see it's also not just a being kind and gentle, but it is also yet still instructive. In fact, that was one of the ways this was translated, is he's instructive. You come away learning something, and not just in his words, but in his deeds. He sets a good example. He practices what he preaches, right? You've heard that expression before. And so he needs to be one who is an example in the things that he's teaching, and able to explain to others why he's doing that. And then lastly, we see this is a lot to take on. And you notice there in verse 6, not a novice, not a neophyte is what they actually say it in the Greek, but not someone who's kind of brand new in this. For two reasons, right? Well, one is that he's taken on a lot. Probably needs to get it figured out a little more before you give him this role, this reputation. And the other reason is because pride is a problem for everybody. But if someone's brand new, then pride can be a real problem in getting the fathead and thinking that he's more of a boss and less of an example. And we start putting on masks and faking it. And that's not good either. We need to be an example in humility, in admitting when we're wrong, admitting our weaknesses, and to show how we're working on those things, striving to improve. And also, you just want to see some consistency. Someone who's been doing the Christian life for a little while and is showing they're going to stick with it. It's one of those very demoralizing things in the greater body of Christ when we see leaders fall and leaders just collapse, quit. It's discouraging. And sometimes leaders need to step back, take on a less role in order to rest and recuperate. It's hard, and it's very hard. We saw during the pandemic a lot of pastors and leaders who had to step back. It was a tough time. I was blessed and protected in that. But I want you to realize, though, that same time, though, we want to see someone who still keeps on being a Christian. It's not just the fad of the year, but this is something they've done with their life. Their life has been changed, yes, but it stays changed. That good testimony among those who are outside, lest he fall under reproach and the snare of the devil. Because it's not only to be a leader to those on the inside, but the outside world is holding pastors to a higher standard as well. And they want to see, is this person for real? Because it's already, as a minority group, they're already looking for stones to throw. And we don't need to give them ammunition. But we need to be examples and practice what we preach. We need to be above reproach, blameless in the eyes of the world as well as in the eyes of the church. And then this probably does go towards having a little grace towards your pastor. If you're not a pastor or looking for a pastor, but you've got one, giving them a little grace. They are held to a higher standard, but at the same time, they're still people. It's a little tough sometimes, but it is such an awesome privilege. It is a good work that God gives an internal calling to do, and so then we strive towards doing it. And so I wanted to finish with just this little story. I was thankful that I was saved as a child, and with a mom and dad who gave me a pretty good example and a place to grow. And then, but the Lord didn't call me into this until much later. And so, even when I was an adult, I strayed. I had my feelings, but I kept coming back to Christ. Never stopped being a Christian. And so then when he did put me in a place where I realized he was wanting to use me in ministry, I was like, okay, well then let's take that next step. And then as I was doing that, he put the desire within me that I wanted to pastor a church. And so he gradually worked me towards that. And I don't know if you know this or not, but Prairie Oaks, being my home church, where I have the privilege of pastoring, is the only church I've ever pastored. This is where God brought me, and this is where they've allowed me to grow into that role. And I'm very thankful for that, as this last month marked 15 years at Prairie Oaks. And so I appreciate the prayers of those who've been helping me as I've grown into this. I'm thankful. So pray for those pastors. Pray for your pastor, whoever he is. And next time, we'll look at some more of those qualifications, but really characteristics that we're looking for in church leadership. So God bless, God keep you. It's a little overwhelming. Thanks for the prayers. Have a good day.